Juliana. This is Trondheim calling. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it down to this conference because of our domestic issues. But it was a real pity because I was really looking forward to having some days discussing the complicated relationships between people and animals from the perspectives of many, many different kind of disciplinary points of view. But such is life, and it's not possible to be in two places at the same time. But luckily, at least technology at least makes it possible for me to make some contribution, albeit from a distance. So what is really exciting, I think, about this conference is a number of perspectives that people are using to look at the relationship between animals and people. And I'm going to come at the same question, but maybe from the perspective of like a more classical conservation framing, especially trying to explore this emerging framing of coexistence. So I'll try to keep this quite short and just give you sort of a flavor for the way that those of us working in applied wildlife conservation are kind of slowly starting to flesh out the idea of coexistence and trying to actually point out what this actually word means, because it's increasingly used in many, many different contexts by many different people. And there still yet is no kind of totally agreed on definition or understanding as to what the word means. So just to kind of look at the question from the start here, I'm going to try and touch in on 4 issues, I guess, kind of during this talk. So first of all, I'll explore some of the complexity of human-animal relationships, especially zooming in on the human-wildlife relationship as a subset of this wider human-animal relationship. I'll then kind of quickly go into the conservation agenda and the way that conservationists are framing issues before I expand more on this idea of coexistence as being one of the emerging frames to look at wildlife conservation. So most of the research on human-animal relationships, especially coming at it from the perspective of the social sciences and humanities, has come from looking largely at kind of the companion animals, laboratory animals, and farm animals, and to a slightly lesser extent to zoo animals. And what kind of describes all of these settings is that there's a very clear sort of human duty of care for the individual animals, because we have created these breeds of animals, or we have put them in very confined situations where we have 100% control over their existence and their well-being, and this has been widely assumed to imply a very clear duty of care. If we're moving onto wildlife, it's a very different setting, because this issue of duty of care is not quite so clear. So the whole ethical framing of this kind of relationship is much more undefined in a way. It also becomes a much more complicated relationship with many different aspects of it. Like an example, on the more kind of positive side of things, we talk about the appreciation of wildlife or the inspiration that wildlife is kind of giving us. Many people choose to believe in the intrinsic value of wildlife, and some even extend this to having a spiritual relationship in both a kind of religious and secular sense. Wildlife also provides an incredible kind of resource for kind of recreation, and this can be kind of non-consumptive in terms of simply wildlife viewing, or it can be kind of consumptive recreation through hunting, which is kind of a pretty much kind of universal activity across Europe at least. Over 5 million hunters are hunting on pretty much the entire land area of our continent. But there's also other aspects of the human kind of wildlife relationships. And it's very important to be aware of the conflicts, the very real conflicts and very real impacts that wildlife can have on humans and human interests. And here we're dealing with things as diverse as wild boar damaging crops, of vehicle collisions between cars and trains and ungulates, and the damage that, say, large carnivores like wolves can do to our livestock. And these conflicts are significant, and in many cases they can be deadly for people. And even apart from the kind of real economic impact, there's still a very kind of significant impact of fear for many people out there, knowing that there's wolves and bears and other large animals out there. So conflicts are certainly real, and they're pretty much kind of universal. But also we can view wildlife as a kind of resource. You know, it has been a resource for us since the Stone Age, or for as long as humans have been humans, and it continues to be a resource today. It can be both for meat or for fur, for skin, for the tusks and the horns of animals, for trophies, and many other things. So we have many, many diverse dimensions of our relationship between humans and animals and wildlife. And the ethical frameworks kind of describing this are very much a work in progress for which we have no universally accepted standards. If we look back at the history of our relationship between humans and wildlife, it's not particularly uplifting. Our species has not been kind to the wild animals that we're sharing our continent with. We have many species where we had simply targeted extermination campaigns, especially on things like, say, wolves and bears and other predators. And for centuries, we basically have been paying people to exterminate them. Other species were kind of subject to totally unregulated exploitation or over-exploitation, and others were simply kind of neglected. We didn't really intend to harm them, but when we pollute rivers, we destroy the habitats, we destroy the ecosystems, many species simply disappeared without people caring or noticing even. So the result of this kind of historical impact of humans on wildlife really reaches peak in the early to mid 20th century in Europe, kind of depending a bit on where you are. And the result was that there was very little wildlife left. Even kind of common species like roe deer, red deer, wild boar were very much gone, exterminated from kind of many countries. So the real low point was maybe 70 years ago. But since then, a lot has changed. The early to mid kind of 20th century saw dramatic changes in social attitude towards wildlife and policies. So kind of first out was like the forestry and wildlife management systems, which in the early 20th century especially began putting a real focus on bringing back kind of forests and bringing back wildlife. It was mainly driven and motivated by hunters who were looking for more game species to hunt. But the result was an incredible effort of kind of restocking wildlife all across our continent and encouraging its kind of return. I think it's often an underappreciated kind of contribution of the hunting community, because it certainly set the scene for a much more holistic and wider ecological restoration of our continent. Then from the 60s and 70s, we saw the kind of environmental movement, which kind of many of us are probably much more kind of familiar with, like kind of keystone books like Silent Spring by Rachel Carson and other things, really triggered a wider awareness of the impact humans were having on the environment, and then the knock-on effect this is having on our health and well-being. You know, then we had the kind of Save the Whale campaigns and all these other kind of campaigns in the 70s and 80s, which really brought environmentalism onto the public agenda. It drifted largely from pollution and charismatic species over to this more broader concept of kind of biodiversity and conservation. And over time, this kind of led to the enactment of formal kind of legislation, like the Berne Convention in 1979, or the Habitat Directive in 1992, which basically set a continental-wide mandate for the conservation of Europe's kind of biodiversity and wildlife. So in other words, it went from being like a fringe or protest movement in the 70s and 80s to being mainstream kind of European and even global policy in the 80s and 90s. Some of the kind of conventions, like the Convention on Biological Diversity or CITES, the Convention on Migratory Species and so on, are global. And then in kind of Europe, we have the Habitat Directive and the Berne Convention that set the overall frames for wildlife conservation and have a very strong regulatory effect on the relationship between humans and wildlife, very much influencing what we can and cannot do, and also implicitly including an awful lot of sort of values about what the intended objective or the intended form of this kind of human-wildlife relationship is actually meant to be. What's probably quite important to underline here is that all of these legislation instruments are mandating conservation of populations. They're not focused on animal rights or even especially on animal welfare, even if that is sort of implicit. It is very much focused on the conservation of the populations and species and ecosystems. But conservation is not just one thing. Conservation is many different things, and there are many different kind of disciplinary framings or discourses out there to describe conservation. Everything like from conservation biology to restoration ecology to compassionate conservation to sustainable use, and it goes on and on. And every year we get more and more framings. Like an example, rewilding has appeared in recent years as a new framing. And these things all contain different strategic elements about how to achieve conservation. They include different ideologies, and some of them are simply just a seemingly random repackaging and kind of creation of new kind of buzzwords. So it creates a very complicated and kind of very difficult, almost like a jungle of different ideas out there. Among these also is the idea of coexistence. And this is very strongly emerging as a new framing in conservation. So a year ago, we produced this kind of paper that kind of reviewed lots of these existing framings and tried to place them in the context of coexistence in context with the other framings out there. And we also did a study some years ago, which actually looked at the values and the strategies which were sort of implicit and sometimes explicit in the existing kind of legislation, to see what was national and global kind of legislation actually mandating in terms of relationships, and where did kind of coexistence appear in these different documents. So what is this thing called coexistence, and where is it coming from? I would guess that the origins of it really come from the fact that we have to recognize that we're living in the Anthropocene. We're living in the era when humans are impacting every hectare of planet Earth. We are the dominant force of nature. We have occupied all land and we are using it to greater degrees. So you can like this or you can hate it, but it is simply a fact. And that means that if wildlife is going to have a space on the planet, it has to live pretty much in shared space with us. There is no sort of wilderness over there in some other place where the wildlife can be and we can be here. Those kind of wildernesses are gone. So the future of wildlife, especially in a crowded kind of continent like Europe, implies that we have to share space. And this automatically leads us then into this kind of concept of coexistence. So we have to coexist in the same space. As a concept, it's really emerged at the intersection between kind of conservation biology, wildlife management, and human-wildlife conflict management. But these have been like the three kind of disciplinary approaches which have led to the creation of the coexistence discourse. But in recent years, it's been more and more kind of diversified, with virtually all of the social sciences and kind of humanities adding very important nuances and complementary elements to building up a much more holistic understanding as to what this framing actually means. Viewing it as a heuristic, the premise is that we are sharing space. And then within it, there's three different sort of areas, in a way, three questions or three kind of prerequisites for conservation to actually work. So the first question is simply, can wildlife live with us? Are wild species able to adapt to the human modified landscape? And this really boils down to a question of ecology. It's simply, can they share our space? The other question, though, is, are we able to live with wildlife? And especially when framing it in terms of the conflicts that often occur. But finally, I think a really important question that comes back again and again, and probably deserves, well, is kind of getting more and more attention, is the question, can people with different perspectives on wildlife and on the most appropriate human-wildlife relationships actually coexist with each other? We're just taking a quick look here at each of these questions. The question of, can wildlife live with us? The answer is very often yes, especially when we're dealing with the bigger, more charismatic species that we often talk about. This is a picture of wolves in a very typical Spanish wolf habitat, and it's really hard to imagine a more human-modified landscape than that one. But in landscapes like this, you have maybe 2,000 wolves, one of the biggest wolf populations in Europe. So the idea that wildlife needs wilderness is not an ecological reality. It's very much sort of a fantasy in a way that's been unpropagated by media. There are many species that do depend on natural habitats, but these are typically the smaller, things like beetles and fungi and other things. The big charismatic wildlife that we often think about as being icons of wilderness is actually very adaptable indeed. So within certain limits, the potential for wildlife, even in our heavily modified European landscapes, is enormous. When it comes of, can we live with wildlife, this really boils down to the fact, are we willing to tolerate or to adapt to the conflicts that wildlife causes for us? In many cases, this is about technical interventions. It's about making adaptations to agriculture and the way that we manage wildlife, or perhaps even maybe regulating the size of wildlife populations to find a level of interaction that is viewed as being sustainable on the part of humans and also for wildlife. So the question here is, largely speaking, that yes, we have many examples of where people and human communities are able to tolerate very high densities of wildlife, but there are clearly limits. And there are certainly places where this tolerance is much lower. So the answer to the question of, can we live with wildlife, will vary from place to place and depend very much on the degree of adaptation that people are willing to make to live close to wildlife. But the really difficult question is the one about, can we live with each other? Because of these dramatic social conflicts which occur between groups of humans who have different views on the appropriate nature of relationship between people and wildlife. For example, a classic debate is issues of hunting. Is it appropriate to hunt or not? But there are many other social conflicts which are very undivisive. What we've also seen is that these conflicts have become more and more politically instrumentalized in populist politics, which really escalate the level of these social conflicts to very high levels and make them very difficult to deal with. To understand these type of issues, we have to resort to almost a full repertoire of disciplines in the social sciences and humanities. Everything from psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, political science, and others. All of those have things to contribute to understanding this really complicated aspect here. But the solutions to these kind of problems involve issues of kind of governance and building strong institutions. So what does this state of coexistence actually look like? Well, I don't think anyone has the full answer because it's very much a work in progress. We have never consciously tried this before in history. It may have happened in some places accidentally. It may have been approached in some places, but a full kind of coexistence is really something very new. But we do see some elements of it, which are probably quite important to underline. So kind of first of all, it does not involve the absence of human-wildlife conflicts, but it does require that they are managed in a way which is kind of tolerable. It also doesn't mean that humans do not kill wildlife. There is no reason that hunting and kind of population regulation cannot be a part of kind of coexistence. And in some cases, it may actually be necessary to achieve that kind of compromise between human interests and wildlife interests, which is needed. And largely, again, this is because we're not living in wildernesses. We're living in very human-dominated worlds. We're living in the Anthropocene. And simply, there is not space to give large mammals the full freedom to do as can they wish in our landscapes. It simply would be too many conflicts with other human interests and human well-being. So kind of coexistence is not some type of, kind of Disney-esque Lion King world of peace and love and natural kind of regulation. It involves fairly strong interactions on both sides, but it involves keeping these interactions within certain frames. And in many ways, this is no different to what ecology is, because ecology is the study or the process of interactions. Things like predation, competition, disease, parasitism. That is what ecology is. And in a way, coexistence does involve quite strong interactions. But what is really important is that the solution or the nature of coexistence is going to vary dramatically from place to place. It will look very different in very different places. Just to illustrate that, Slovenia and Croatia for the last 4 years have been running a lynx conservation project called Life Lynx, which has been aimed at bringing back extra individuals from Slovakia and Romania to improve the genetic situation of wild lynx in Slovenia and Croatia. But this has been a really kind of successful hands-on conservation project. So the coexistence between lynx and humans in Slovenia and Croatia involves fairly strong and sometimes quite invasive kind of conservation actions, but all designed to help lynx survive. In a Norwegian context, the coexistence between lynx and people is a much more kind of complicated affair, where we have quite strong conflicts with our livestock, and we also have lynx hunting as an element to balance the size of the lynx population and contain conflicts. But these are just two different faces of how coexistence can look, and how the management and interventions are going to look in different places with the same species. So the whole idea of kind of coexistence, kind of like I said, is very much a work in progress. And there's quite a lot of literature emerging out there. So these are just some kind of papers and kind of reports and collections of papers which are adding interesting little insights into this very much emerging concept, which I think remains the only viable framing which allows space for wildlife and people in our crowded, human-dominated world into the future. So I think that's all I have time for. And now I'll happily take any questions, hopefully by Zoom, if we can get the link to work. So thank you for your attention.